The email arrived just after noon, buried between routine notifications. He reread the subject line 3 times before opening it, not trusting the quiet tone of the office around him. Approval was a word that had felt distant for weeks, almost irresponsible to hope for. His hand stayed still on the desk as he read every sentence slowly, absorbing the conditions, the numbers, the dates. Nothing celebratory, nothing dramatic, just a formal confirmation that his future wouldn't collapse this month. Relief didn't rush in. It settled cautiously, like someone stepping onto thin ice. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, thinking of unpaid bills stacked neatly at home, of promises made to his child without knowing how to keep them. The loan wasn't freedom, but it was time. Time to breathe, time to adjust. He knew better than to feel grateful to a system that had kept him waiting, measuring his worth in percentages. The meeting had been brief. She sat across the desk with a neutral expression, her tone efficient, her questions precise. No small talk, no reassurance, just paperwork slid forward and a pen placed carefully within reach. She explained the terms without looking up, as if rehearsed, as if his situation was one of dozens she'd handled that week. He nodded where expected, signed where indicated, careful not to reveal how much depended on her final approval. When she finally met his eyes, it was only for a second, long enough to confirm identity, not circumstance. She confirmed the approval calmly, the way someone confirms a delivery time. He thanked her, his voice controlled, professional, shaped by years of learning not to ask for sympathy. She responded with a polite acknowledgement and stood, already mentally elsewhere. The interaction ended without ceremony, but its impact followed him out the door. Outside, the air felt different. The city noise pressed in, cars passing, people moving with purpose he envied. He checked his phone again, half expecting the message to disappear. Approval still there. He thought about how fragile his relief felt, how dependent it was on a decision made by someone who didn't know his nights or his fears. Stability, he realized, often rested on strangers who never noticed. On the train home, he replayed the meeting, searching for signs he might have missed. There were none, just procedure. Still, something about the final glance lingered, not emotional, not personal, just observant. He dismissed the thought as stress. Weeks of uncertainty had trained his mind to look for danger even in resolution. He reminded himself this was good news. It had to be. At home, he placed the printed approval on the kitchen counter, smoothing the paper flat. His child was at school, the apartment quiet. He allowed himself a moment to imagine groceries bought without calculation, rent paid early, a future measured in months instead of days. The feeling was tentative, restrained by experience. He had learned that progress didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in, hoping not to be noticed. That night, as he turned off the lights, the approval sat folded in his bag, no longer just a document, but a fragile agreement holding his life together. He didn't think about the woman again. Not really. To him, she was part of the process, a necessary signature. He couldn't know then that this ordinary approval, handled with professional distance, was only the beginning of something far less procedural. 3 days after the approval, he found himself back near the bank without planning to. An errand nearby had pulled him into the same street, the same glass facade reflecting the afternoon light. He walked past with his head down, thinking only of time, of getting home before traffic thickened. That was when he noticed someone struggling near the curb, arms full, clearly irritated by the sudden failure of something ordinary. He almost kept walking, instinct telling him distance was safer. The situation was simple enough. A stalled car, hazard lights blinking, a bag torn open on the sidewalk. He hesitated, then stepped closer, asking if she needed help. Only when she looked up did recognition flicker, brief but unmistakable. The professional mask wasn't there, no desk, no paperwork, no authority implied by position. Just a woman annoyed by inconvenience, momentarily unsure. The shift unsettled him more than he expected, as if the rules had quietly changed. He helped without comment, lifting what had fallen, checking what he could without invading space. Their conversations stayed practical, focused on the problem at hand. Still, the familiarity of her face pulled him back to that office, that desk, that signature that had decided so much. He was aware of how easily the moment could turn awkward, how thin the line was between courtesy and complication. He kept his tone neutral, careful. She thanked him once, then again, more sincerely. The words felt different outside the building where she held authority. For the first time, he noticed details he hadn't before. Tiredness around her eyes, impatience softened by relief. She asked how things were going, the question casual, almost reflexive. He answered briefly, instinctively guarding how much truth he allowed himself to share. Some habits didn't disappear just because circumstances improved. People passed around them, indifferent, absorbed in their own urgency. The city moved on without noticing how the balance between them had subtly shifted. He realized he was no longer just a file number or a financial profile. He was a person who had helped her when no one else stopped. That realization made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't fully explain why. Gratitude, he knew, could complicate power. She mentioned the approval, lightly, as if confirming whether. He nodded, acknowledging it without celebration. The loan still felt conditional in his mind, something that could be revoked by forces he didn't control. Her tone suggested reassurance, but reassurance from someone tied to his stability carried weight. He felt the urge to step back, to re-establish distance, yet the street offered no clear boundary. When the problem was resolved, there was a pause neither of them filled immediately. It lingered just long enough to suggest that something else could be said. He broke it first, wishing her a good afternoon, already turning away. Ending the interaction felt like restoring order, even if only for himself. He didn't look back, afraid that doing so would invite meaning where he wanted none. As he walked off, the encounter replayed in fragments. Nothing inappropriate had happened. No lines crossed. And yet, the simplicity of it disturbed him. The woman who approved his loan now existed in his life outside that office, attached to a memory that wasn't transactional. He understood then that distance, once lost, was difficult to recover, and that this meeting, however ordinary it seemed, would not be easily forgotten. The rain started without warning, heavy enough to scatter the few people still lingering on the sidewalk. She stood beneath the narrow awning of a closed shop, struggling to manage an umbrella that refused to cooperate. He was already soaked. Jacket darkened, bag pressed close to his side. Passing her again felt coincidental, almost scripted by the city's small indifferences. He slowed, not out of obligation, but because leaving someone to wrestle alone with something so trivial felt unnecessary. She laughed quietly at herself when he offered help, the sound brief and unguarded. He held the umbrella steady while she adjusted the bent frame, fingers working quickly, efficiently. The exchange required no explanation, no reference to who they were beyond the moment. Rain blurred the street, softened the edges of buildings, reduced the world to immediate tasks. For a few seconds, there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to calculate, just shared inconvenience. The umbrella finally opened, imperfect but usable. He handed it back without ceremony, stepping aside to give her space. She thanked him, her tone casual, almost relieved. There was no hint of authority, no professional distance, just politeness between two people temporarily aligned by circumstance. He nodded, ready to move on, the moment already fading in his mind as something forgettable. She hesitated before leaving, commenting on the weather, on how the city never seemed prepared for its own climate. He responded automatically, a neutral remark shaped by habit. Conversation, when it happened, stayed safely on the surface. Neither asked questions that mattered. Neither offered details that might invite scrutiny. It felt clean that way, contained. As they stood there, a bus splashed past, water spraying across the curb. He stepped back instinctively, avoiding it, noticing how quickly he reacted to protect his bag. She noticed too, remarking lightly about how everyone carried their lives in pieces these days. The comment landed softly, but it lingered longer than he expected. He didn't respond, unsure if it required one. When the rain eased, she thanked him again, this time with a small smile that seemed genuine, uncalculated. She turned to leave, then paused, as if considering something else, before continuing on her way. He watched her go, telling himself there was nothing to analyze. People helped each other every day. Most moments didn't mean more than they were. He continued walking, shoes damp, thoughts drifting back to practical concerns waiting at home. Groceries, schedules, bills. The encounter receded, folding into the background of his day. If asked later, he might struggle to explain why it stood out at all. There was no reason it should have. Yet that evening, while hanging his jacket to dry, the memory returned uninvited. Not as tension, not as curiosity, but as awareness. A simple act, unrecorded, had shifted something subtle. He couldn't name it, only recognize that what felt ordinary at the time had quietly altered the space between them, even if neither of them realized it yet. She stopped a few steps ahead of him, her pace slowing as if a thought had caught up to her. He noticed the change immediately, the way her shoulders tightened before she turned back. Her eyes moved over his face with new attention, not searching this time, but confirming. The casual ease from moments earlier faded, replaced by a subtle recalibration. He understood then that something had clicked, that the familiarity he had tried to ignore had finally found its place. "You were at the bank," she said, not as a question. Her voice was calm, but different, measured, deliberate. The rain-muted street seemed suddenly too quiet. He nodded once, keeping his response minimal. There was no reason to deny it, no benefit in explaining. Recognition settled between them, reshaping the space they stood in. What had been ordinary a moment ago now carried an unspoken structure. Her expression shifted, not to surprise, but to awareness. She glanced briefly at the building behind them, then back at him, as if mapping the distance between that office and this sidewalk. The power she held there hadn't disappeared out here. It had only followed her in a quieter form. He felt it immediately, the way context reasserted itself without announcement. She mentioned the loan again, this time more directly, not the details, just the fact of it. He responded carefully, acknowledging without inviting discussion. Gratitude felt dangerous in that moment, too loaded. He was aware of how easily a simple conversation could tilt, how quickly roles could re-establish themselves even outside formal walls. The rain no longer softened anything. For the first time, she studied him beyond courtesy, not intrusive, but assessing, as if aligning memory with reality. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't before, no longer anonymous. His help moments earlier now carried weight, reframed by what she knew. Kindness, he realized, was rarely neutral when history entered the picture. She apologized lightly for not recognizing him sooner, though her tone suggested professionalism rather than regret. He waved it off, instinctively minimizing the moment. Drawing attention to it felt unwise. He sensed that acknowledgement itself had shifted something irreversible. The distance he'd assumed was fragile had already narrowed. People passed them, unaware of the recalibration taking place. The city didn't pause for power dynamics or unspoken leverage. He became conscious of his posture, his words, the timing of his responses. Every small choice felt suddenly visible. This was no longer a random encounter. It had context now, and context carried consequences. When they finally parted, the goodbye felt different, clean on the surface, complicated underneath. He walked away knowing the interaction would not remain isolated in memory. Recognition had tied this moment to others, past and future. What unsettled him most was how quietly it had happened, without confrontation, without warning, as if the balance between them had simply been waiting to return. She hesitated before speaking again, long enough for him to think the moment had passed. Then she lowered her voice, not out of secrecy but intention. "I should tell you something," she said, eyes steady, unreadable. The sentence itself was simple, but the way she framed it made his chest tighten. It wasn't casual conversation anymore. It was a choice to cross into something personal, something that couldn't be unheard once spoken. She explained that she remembered his file now, not just the numbers, but the notes. A single parent, tight margins, no room for error. She said it calmly, as if reciting facts. But the implication settled heavily between them. The loan approval, she implied, hadn't been automatic. It had required discretion, judgment. He felt his stomach drop, realizing how fragile his relief had always been. Then came the words that froze him. She told him that help, even small acts, had a way of circling back, that people noticed who stepped in and who walked away. The comment wasn't a threat, not overtly, but it wasn't neutral either. It reframed the umbrella, the stalled car, the approval, all of it, as parts of a single, connected exchange. He suddenly felt as though he'd agreed to something without knowing the terms. He tried to respond, but found only cautious silence. Any reaction felt like confirmation. Any denial felt naive. She watched him closely, as if measuring his understanding rather than his answer. The power dynamic wasn't loud or aggressive. It was precise. She didn't need to say more. The weight of her words came from what they suggested, not what they demanded. She clarified that nothing was expected, at least not now. The phrase lingered unpleasantly. Not now implied later, implied options. He realized she was defining the narrative, setting boundaries that favored her without asking his consent. The loan, once a closed chapter, reopened in his mind as something conditional, alive, capable of being reshaped. Around them, life continued uninterrupted. A couple passed laughing. A phone rang somewhere nearby. The normalcy made the moment feel sharper, more isolating. He nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. He needed space, time to understand what had just shifted. Her words had quietly rewritten the meaning of everything that came before. She stepped back, signaling the conversation's end, and wished him well with a polite finality. The professionalism returned, but it felt performative now, layered over something else. He watched her walk away, aware that the interaction had drawn an invisible line he hadn't seen forming. One sentence had done what weeks of waiting had not. It had turned stability into leverage. As he stood there alone, the rain fully gone, he understood that the loan was no longer just financial. It carried expectation, memory, and imbalance. The help he'd offered without thought now felt accounted for, recorded in a way he hadn't agreed to, and though nothing explicit had been asked, he knew with unsettling clarity that this was not the end of the exchange, but the beginning of its consequences. He walked for several blocks before realizing he had no clear destination. His steps were steady, automatic, while his thoughts lagged behind, trying to catch up. The street looked the same as it always had. Storefronts, traffic, people absorbed in their own routines, but he felt slightly out of place within it. The conversation replayed in fragments, not the words themselves, but their weight. Silence followed him, heavy and unresolved. The approval that had once felt like solid ground now shifted beneath him. It hadn't been revoked, not threatened outright, yet it no longer felt settled. He imagined it as something held loosely, capable of being tightened or released depending on circumstances beyond his control. That uncertainty pressed against his chest, making each breath more deliberate. Stability, he realized, could exist and still feel temporary. He checked his phone out of habit, as if expecting a message that would confirm his fears. There was nothing. No follow-up, no clarification. The absence itself became its own message. Silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was loaded. He wondered whether acknowledging the moment would make things worse or better. Either option felt like a risk he hadn't consented to take. At home, he moved quietly, setting his keys down, washing his hands longer than necessary. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closer. He glanced at the approval document where it sat folded in his bag, resisting the urge to pull it out again. Reading it wouldn't change anything. What had changed was his understanding of it. He prepared dinner mechanically, following routine to avoid thinking, chopping vegetables, stirring, cleaning as he went. Familiar motions grounded him, but only briefly. Beneath them, unease settled in. He thought about how easily help had transformed into obligation, how quickly a simple interaction had acquired meaning he couldn't discard. That night, sleep came in short intervals. Each time he woke, the same questions surfaced. What exactly had she meant? The lack of clarity gnawed at him more than a direct threat would have. Ambiguity allowed for imagination, and imagination filled gaps with worst-case outcomes. He had worked too hard to be careless now. In the days that followed, he said nothing. He avoided the area near the bank, adjusted his schedule, limited unnecessary contact. Silence became a strategy, though he wasn't sure what it protected. The weight he carried wasn't visible, but it influenced every decision. He measured words more carefully, even with people who had nothing to do with the situation. By the end of the week, he understood that the burden wasn't just fear of losing the loan. It was the knowledge that something essential had shifted without his permission. Trust had been replaced by vigilance. What once felt like progress now demanded caution. And as he moved through his days, he carried that awareness quietly, knowing that the real cost of the approval might not be financial at all. At home, the pressure took on a different shape. It wasn't theoretical or emotional in the abstract. It lived in schedules taped to the fridge and envelopes stacked by the door. His child talked about school projects and upcoming tests with casual confidence, unaware of how closely their sense of safety depended on numbers he kept recalculating in his head. Stability was not a concept. It was rent paid on time, lights that stayed on, mornings without tension. He listened carefully, responding where expected, nodding at the right moments. Parenthood required presence even when his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He reminded himself that whatever uncertainty he carried could not spill outward. Children noticed silence, noticed distraction. Trust was built from consistency, from small promises kept without explanation. He could not afford to let his inner conflict fracture that. Later, alone in the kitchen, he opened his laptop and reviewed the loan terms again. The numbers hadn't changed, but his interpretation had. Each payment date felt provisional now, each clause open to interpretation. He imagined scenarios he had never considered before, contingencies that once felt unnecessary. Financial stability had always required discipline. Now it demanded vigilance. School emails arrived with routine requests, fees, permission slips, reminders. None of them were large, none unreasonable. Together, they formed a steady reminder of responsibility. His child trusted that he would handle these things quietly, competently. That trust weighed on him more than fear. Losing money would be difficult, losing reliability would be worse. He thought about how easily one imbalance could ripple outward. A missed payment, a sudden delay, a shift in circumstances he couldn't explain. Children asked questions, adults weren't always ready to answer. He promised himself that whatever happened, the home would remain calm. Fear would not be the inheritance he passed down. The silence he carried from the street followed him into bedtime routines. Stories read aloud, lights dimmed, reassurances offered without knowing how long they would hold true. He realized how much of parenting involved absorbing uncertainty so it didn't reach smaller shoulders. The cost of that absorption was invisible but constant. When the apartment finally settled into quiet, he sat alone, listening to familiar nighttime sounds. The weight he carried was sharper here, grounded in consequence. Stability wasn't about comfort, it was about continuity. He understood that every choice now would echo beyond him, shaping not just outcomes, but trust. By morning, the pressure had clarified something essential. Whatever leverage existed elsewhere, his responsibility at home was absolute. No approval, no favor, no unspoken expectation outweighed that. The stakes were no longer just personal, they were lived daily, measured in ordinary moments that depended entirely on his ability to keep standing ground beneath his child's feet. The first message arrived late in the afternoon, brief and outwardly harmless. A simple check-in, phrased professionally, detached from context. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, reading it several times before responding with a neutral acknowledgement. Nothing in the wording crossed a line, yet the timing felt intentional. Contact itself had become the signal. Silence was no longer mutual. It had been interrupted. After that, the encounters multiplied in small, controlled ways. A forwarded article related to finance. A comment about how unpredictable systems could be. Each message carried plausible deniability, wrapped in relevance. He replied sparingly, choosing words that closed conversations rather than extended them. Still, each exchange left him more aware of how easily access had been established. He noticed how often his phone was in his hand, not to respond, but to anticipate. The absence of direct pressure was almost worse than an overt demand. Implication required interpretation, and interpretation invited doubt. He questioned whether he was overreacting, whether stress had sharpened his perception unfairly. But instinct told him something was being tested. At work and at home, he maintained routine, but beneath it ran constant calculation. How much distance was enough? What constituted engagement? He wondered if ignoring a message would be read as defiance or simply disinterest. Boundaries once clear had blurred into guesswork. He had not agreed to this ambiguity, yet it now shaped his days. Another message arrived, this one referencing the original approval indirectly. No mention of numbers or documents, just a reminder of how complex decisions often depended on human judgment. The phrasing was calm, almost reflective. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Nothing had been asked, but something had been reinforced. Awareness. He considered documenting everything, then dismissed the thought. Documentation implied escalation, and escalation carried risk. Without a clear violation, action felt premature, yet inaction felt complicit. The balance he tried to maintain required constant adjustment, a vigilance that drained him more than confrontation might have. At night, the implications replayed in his mind. He imagined future requests disguised as favors, expectations framed as gratitude. He resented how easily the situation occupied mental space meant for other concerns. The subtlety of it all made resistance feel rude, disproportionate, as if he were reacting to something that technically did not exist. By the end of the week, he understood the test was not about compliance, but awareness. She was measuring how much he would tolerate, how far the line could move without protest. The realization hardened something in him. Boundaries, he knew now, would not hold themselves. If he didn't define them soon, they would be defined for him. The decision did not arrive as a moment of clarity, but as exhaustion. He grew tired of measuring every word, of rereading messages for hidden meaning, of carrying a silence that no longer protected him. Staying quiet had felt safe at first, a way to preserve what little stability he had secured. Now it felt like erosion, slow and constant, wearing down his sense of control. Silence had a cost, and he was paying it daily. He listed the risks in his head over and over, Speaking up could destabilize everything: loan, reputation, future plans built on fragile trust. Acting might provoke retaliation, wrapped in procedure and professionalism. Yet doing nothing allowed the situation to define him quietly, to turn his compliance into precedent. The balance between caution and courage narrowed until it felt impossible to stand still. He imagined explaining the situation to someone else, stripping it of emotion. The facts sounded thin when spoken aloud. No threats, no demands, just implications. He understood how easily it could be dismissed, how vulnerable he would appear for raising concern without evidence of wrongdoing. That vulnerability frightened him more than conflict. Exposure without protection was its own risk. At home, watching his child move through familiar routines, the question sharpened. What example did silence set? He didn't want stability purchased at the expense of integrity, yet integrity without stability felt equally dangerous. Parenthood complicated courage. Decisions were no longer about personal resilience alone, but about safeguarding a future that depended on him. He considered incremental action, setting firmer boundaries, limiting contact further. Each option felt temporary, a delay rather than a solution. The situation demanded acknowledgement, if only internally. He realized that avoiding risk entirely was no longer possible. The choice was not between safety and danger, but between different kinds of loss. One evening, he drafted a message he never sent, clear, respectful, firm. It stated limits without accusation. Reading it back, he felt both relief and fear. Relief at the clarity, fear at the potential consequences. He saved it, knowing the act of writing had already shifted something inside him. The next step, whatever it was, would cost him something. Time, peace, certainty. He accepted that truth slowly. Growth, he had learned, rarely came without exposure. Protection sometimes required confrontation. The quiet he had maintained was no longer neutral. It was a choice with consequences. By the end of that week, he understood that risk was unavoidable. Acting might threaten his stability. Staying silent threatened his autonomy. Either path demanded sacrifice. What mattered now was choosing which loss he could live with and which one he would refuse to normalize, even if the outcome remained uncertain. He did not wake up to a dramatic turning point or a decisive victory. What changed came quietly, through actions that felt small but deliberate. He limited contact, responded only when necessary, and chose clarity over courtesy. There were no confrontations, no formal complaints, no public fallout, just a slow reclaiming of space. The approval remained intact, at least for now, but it no longer defined his sense of security the way it once had. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't heavy or anxious, it was intentional. He stopped waiting for messages, stopped bracing for implications hidden between polite lines. The absence of contact felt like tension at first, then like relief. Whatever calculation had been taking place elsewhere had met resistance, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough to shift direction. At home, life continued with its ordinary demands. Bills were paid, school routines held. Laughter returned in small, unremarkable moments that mattered more than he admitted. Stability was still fragile, still dependent on factors beyond his control, but it was no longer compromised by quiet fear. He had not secured certainty, but he had protected dignity, and that mattered. He understood that nothing had been resolved in the traditional sense. No apology was offered, no lesson was taught. The imbalance had not disappeared from the world, but within his own life, something essential had been corrected. He was no longer participating in an exchange he had not agreed to. The approval had cost him innocence, perhaps, but not agency. There were nights when doubt returned, when he wondered if a different choice would have brought more peace. The future remained unclear. The loan was still a responsibility, not a rescue. Yet uncertainty felt more manageable now that it was honest. Fear loses power when it is faced without submission. He thought sometimes about how easily the situation could be misunderstood by outsiders. How uneventful it might sound. No villains, no heroes, just pressure, implication, and choice. Real life rarely offered clean endings. What mattered was not how the story would be judged, but how it would be lived afterward. In the months that followed, he noticed a subtle change in himself. He trusted his instincts more. He no longer dismissed discomfort as overreaction. The experience had sharpened his awareness, not hardened him. He remained cautious, but not closed, resilient, but not bitter. The approval had given him time, nothing more. What he reclaimed was something deeper, the right to define the terms of his own stability. Not everything was recovered, and maybe it never would be. But what remained was enough: quiet resolve, earned clarity, and the knowledge that even under pressure he had chosen not to disappear.